Daniel Harper had grown accustomed to the glittering skyline of Manhattan, but lately, the city's brilliance seemed to mock him rather than comfort. From his apartment on the 37th floor of a sleek building overlooking the Hudson, he could see the familiar contours of the city lights flickering like distant stars, taxis weaving through avenues, and the river reflecting the chaos of life below. To anyone else, it would have appeared the perfect life: a thriving career in finance, a penthouse apartment, and Olivia, his wife of 20 years, elegant and composed, standing beside him like the ultimate portrait of success. They hosted dinner parties that dazzled their social circle, tables set with crystal glasses, silver cutlery gleaming under soft lighting, and wine that cost more than some people earned in a month. Their social media accounts were curated to perfection. Images of Olivia laughing, Daniel holding a glass of champagne, friends raising toasts, all captured to convey warmth, happiness, and accomplishment. Onlookers would envy their apparent harmony. Yet behind the filtered smiles and staged candor, Daniel felt a tension that refused to dissolve. It was the small things that unsettled him first. A pause too long before Olivia picked up her phone. A whispered conversation at odd hours, quickly ended when he entered the room. The way she sometimes stared out the window, lost in thought, her fingers drumming against the kitchen counter in rhythms he did not understand. For 20 years, he had thought he knew her every nuance, every mood, every unspoken word. Now, each gesture seemed foreign, a coded message just beyond his comprehension. Daniel tried to tell himself it was stress from work, from the relentless pace of Manhattan life. But the unease gnawed at him. Relentless and persistent, memories of earlier days surfaced unbidden. Late nights in their first apartment in Brooklyn, when money was tight, but laughter was abundant. Quiet mornings on the roof of a smaller building, sharing coffee and unspoken dreams. Those moments were intimate, raw, imperfect, but authentic. And yet, looking at Olivia now, with her carefully chosen attire, her polished smile, and the effortless way she navigated social gatherings, he felt the gap between them, widening with every passing day. There was a note of irony in their life's perfection. Daniel, a meticulous planner, had always believed that success, stability, and appearances would shield their marriage from the ordinary trials of life. Yet, he realized that perfection could not mask absence, not emotional absence, not the slow erosion of connection that no amount of champagne, silk dresses, or evening parties could hide. Tonight, as he set the table for another meticulously arranged dinner, Daniel watched Olivia move through the apartment with her usual grace. She laughed at a joke from one of her colleagues, a laugh polished and familiar to the guests but hollow in its resonance for him. Her gaze flickered toward the balcony briefly, her lips parting slightly as if to speak but withholding the words. Daniel's pulse quickened not with passion, but with the creeping suspicion that something vital was slipping through his fingers. He remembered the way she used to speak to him across the breakfast table 20 years ago. The warmth in her voice, the way her eyes held a silent promise of partnership, of shared struggles and victories. Now, those breakfasts had been replaced with parallel routines. She disappeared into her world of appointments, calls, and social obligations. He into the spreadsheets, meetings, and endless calculations of his financial empire. They coexisted rather than connected. A soft ping from her phone drew his attention. Olivia glanced at it, a flicker of tension crossing her features before it was replaced with her practiced calm. She excused herself, retreating to another room. Daniel remained at the table, the clink of silverware in his hand echoing in the otherwise quiet apartment. He could not shake the feeling that he was witnessing the final scenes of a play in which he had been cast unwittingly. The script was unknown, the actors improvising around him, and he was left reading lines that no longer made sense. As he sipped his wine, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. 20 years of marriage had passed like the steady flow of the Hudson outside his window, constant, inevitable, and inescapable. He had believed that love was enough, that commitment alone would withstand time's erosion. Now, in the hushed pauses, the unspoken silences, the shadowed corners of their conversations, He understood that knowing someone fully was a myth. That familiarity did not guarantee understanding. That even shared history could not prevent distance from creeping in, quiet but inexorable. Daniel set down the glass and let his eyes drift to Olivia's reflection in the living room mirror. There she was, elegant, radiant, flawless. And yet, he saw the fissures he had never dared acknowledge, the distance in her eyes, the guarded gestures, the secrets that whispered louder than words. He had built a life of illusions, meticulously curated and publicly admired, yet privately hollow. And in the quiet of the Manhattan night, Daniel Harper realized, for the first time with piercing clarity, that perfection was only a mask, and behind it, the real story, the vulnerabilities, betrayals, and desires awaited revelation. The apartment felt unusually silent that evening, as if the city outside had pressed pause, waiting for what was about to unfold within those walls. Daniel Harper had noticed the subtle signs for months, the whispered calls, the hesitant smiles, the distant gaze of his wife, but nothing could have prepared him for the words Olivia would speak. She stood in the kitchen, framed by the soft glow of the chandelier, her posture poised yet somehow trembling, as if every syllable she was about to utter had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Daniel, seated at the dining table, noticed her fingers fidgeting with the cuff of her sleeve, a small gesture that betrayed a nervousness her composed exterior tried to mask. "Daniel," she began, voice calm but deliberate. "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving you." Her eyes met his, searching, as though hoping to measure his reaction. "I'm going back to Ethan. And I want half of everything." The words hit him like a physical blow. Daniel's chest tightened, a rush of disbelief and betrayal flooding every fiber of his being. For a moment, he could only stare, unblinking, feeling the apartment sway around him, as if gravity itself had shifted. The perfect life he had meticulously curated, the facade of stability and success, had cracked in an instant. He felt the heat of anger rise, but more pressing than the fury was a hollow ache, the kind that gnawed quietly at the edges of his consciousness. 20 years. 20 years of shared mornings, quiet conversations, and whispered dreams. And now, it all seemed to dissolve into a memory that smelled faintly of betrayal. Daniel clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to breathe evenly, to maintain the calm exterior that Olivia's gaze seemed to demand. "You're serious?" His voice was steady, measured, though his mind raced, trying to process the enormity of her confession. Olivia nodded, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She looked away, towards the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold and white. "I am. I've thought about this for a long time. It's not just about me. I need to follow my own path. And Ethan, he's part of that path." Daniel's mind reeled. Ethan Lawson. The name itself carried a weight of history he had long buried. College days, early love letters tucked away in drawers, photographs that once meant everything, now resurfacing to haunt him. He remembered Olivia as she had been. Laughter spilling over shared meals in tiny apartments, eyes sparkling with mischief and unspoken promises. And now, that Olivia seemed both familiar and impossibly distant. He wanted to speak, to argue, to demand understanding, yet words felt inadequate, powerless. All he could manage was a quiet, "After 20 years," his voice trailed. The rest left unsaid, hanging between them like a fragile thread. Olivia's gaze returned to him, softer now, tinged with regret, but resolute. "I know it's sudden, I know it hurts, but it's the truth." She paused, and for the first time, Daniel saw vulnerability peek through her controlled exterior. "I don't want to hurt you more than I have to, but I can't stay. I need this." The apartment seemed to shrink around Daniel, the space compressed by the weight of revelation. Memories, once comforting, now pricked with sharp edges. He recalled early mornings when Olivia had rested her head on his shoulder, evenings when laughter had filled rooms that now seemed hollow, and the promises they had whispered to each other in the quiet hours. The juxtaposition of past intimacy and present fracture made his heart ache with an unfamiliar heaviness. He studied her, the tilt of her head, the slight furrow of her brow, the delicate hands that had once reached for his without hesitation. Everything about her screamed both inevitability and impossibility. Daniel's mind raced with questions. Why now? Why Ethan? Was this desire genuine, or had time and distance simply revealed cracks he had been blind to? Time stretched, elongated by the tension, until Daniel realized he had to respond. Yet his response was not the explosive outburst he might have expected. It was a measured, almost hollow calm, masking the storm within. Olivia, if this is truly what you want, then we need to discuss this rationally. His words were careful, diplomatic, a thin veneer over the churning maelstrom of shock, anger, and grief that threatened to consume him. Olivia nodded, relief flickering across her face, though it quickly gave way to that practiced composure she always carried. She moved towards the balcony, letting the cool night air brush against her cheeks, while Daniel sat still, staring at the faint reflection of the chandelier in the polished table. Seeing himself fractured in pieces he was not sure he could gather. For the rest of the evening, they spoke in measured tones, discussing logistics, timelines, and the painfully practical realities of dividing life's material markers. Each word, each calculation, was punctuated by silent recollections, moments that no accounting could ever quantify. Daniel felt the tension between what had been and what was becoming, the bittersweet ache of nostalgia colliding with the sting of betrayal. As night deepened, the city outside continued its relentless pulse, unaware of the quiet unraveling happening above. Daniel Harper, despite the meticulous control he prided himself on, felt powerless against the tidal wave of change. He knew that the coming days would demand choices, confrontations, and a reckoning with truths he had long avoided. And in the midst of this storm, one question lingered above all. Could the love of 20 years survive a revelation so utterly shattering? Or would it crumble entirely, leaving only the raw ache of what had been? The first traces of betrayal are often subtle, almost imperceptible, until they demand acknowledgement. Daniel Harper sat in the quiet of his office, the city lights outside casting elongated shadows across the polished oak desk. His laptop screen glowed softly, emails stacked in neat folders, attachments waiting silently for his eyes to open them. Each click, each file he opened, felt like lifting a veil he had long been afraid to disturb. He began with the obvious, scanning through Olivia's old correspondence. Emails marked as personal revealed lines of flirtation, shared secrets, and longing that stretched far back before any hint of marital fracture. Some were brief, almost innocuous, but the tone was unmistakable, an intimacy reserved for someone beyond the bounds of their present life. Daniel felt the chill of disbelief creep over him. It wasn't just the past he was uncovering, it was the quiet persistence of emotions that had never entirely faded. Photographs followed. Hidden in digital archives, images of Olivia and Ethan together surfaced moments, frozen in time at places Daniel had never visited, smiles that carried a private joy, eyes that lingered longer than propriety would allow. He stared at one photo longer than he intended. A summer evening, golden light slanting across their faces. Olivia's hand rested on Ethan's arm, fingers barely touching, yet Daniel could sense the unspoken tension in that light brush. Letters, some handwritten and carefully folded, added layers to the revelation. Words meant for Ethan's eyes alone spoke of dreams, regrets, and confessions that Daniel had never been part of. In these letters, she had poured fragments of her soul, moments of longing, expressions of doubt about her marriage, and fantasies of a life that might have been. Each sentence Daniel read carved deeper into the foundation of the life he thought he understood. Daniel remembered his own role in their early years, the sacrifices he had made, the late nights working, the weekends spent ensuring their home was comfortable, the vacations meticulously planned to create memories he believed would bind them. He thought of the small smiles, the quiet mornings, the laughter that once filled their kitchen. Yet, every recollection now felt tinged with irony, like a carefully framed painting hiding cracks beneath the surface. The more he uncovered, the more he realized the depth of the dissonance. Olivia had never stopped feeling something for Ethan. These feelings had coexisted with her life with Daniel, parallel currents that had silently shaped her choices. The realization gnawed at Daniel, a slow burn that unsettled every certainty he had clung to. Questions swirled in his mind. When did she last love him fully? Did she ever truly love him in the present? Or had she been performing a role, sustaining an image of a happy wife while her heart wandered elsewhere? The evidence demanded confrontation, yet Daniel hesitated. There was a morbid curiosity in knowing, a painful anticipation of the confession he was not sure he wanted to hear. And in that hesitation, he found clarity. He could no longer navigate their marriage on assumption or trust alone. He needed the full picture, no matter how painful. Late into the night, Daniel sifted through a folder labeled Vacation Memories, a collection of images from years past. He paused at a photo from a summer trip to Cape Cod. Olivia and Ethan laughing on the deck of a small rented cottage, oblivious to the camera. Immersed in a private joke, Daniel traced the curve of her smile with his eyes, recalling the way she had smiled at him in their early days. The difference was unmistakable, subtle yet absolute. This smile belonged to a time before their lives became intertwined with obligations, before social facades took precedence over authentic desire. He thought of Ethan, tall, confident, with an easy charm that had once captivated Olivia. Daniel remembered meeting him years ago at a college reunion. The casual handshake, the effortless laughter, the way Olivia's eyes had lingered just a moment too long. That moment, once dismissed as nostalgia, now appeared as a seed, quietly growing beneath the surface of their marriage. Daniel closed the laptop, rubbing his temples, the weight of revelation pressing against his temples. He felt the conflict churning inside him. Anger. Yes. But also grief. A profound mourning for a life he thought he had shared fully. He realized that betrayal was not a single act but a series of quiet omissions and unspoken truths that had accumulated over time. And as he stared out the window at the Manhattan skyline, he felt a sense of inevitability. The next steps would require courage, strategic thought, and perhaps a willingness to confront Olivia with truths she might still wish to keep hidden. In that quiet hour, Daniel understood that the past, long buried and carefully curated, had resurfaced to dictate the present. The illusions of 20 years had fractured, revealing the complex terrain of love, desire, and secrecy. And somewhere in that fractured landscape lay the answers. Daniel sought, not just about Olivia, not just about Ethan, but about himself, about the choices he had made, and the resilience he would need to navigate the turbulent path ahead. For Daniel Harper, uncovering hidden truths was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. Reconciling memory with reality, emotion with reason, and trust with betrayal. All under the relentless glare of a city that never sleeps, never forgives, and never forgets. The apartment seemed smaller that evening, the air thick with unspoken words. Daniel Harper had summoned the courage to sit across from Olivia, a fragile tension stretching between them like a taut wire. They had been together for 20 years, yet in that moment, it felt as though he was meeting a stranger, a woman whose presence was familiar in form but alien in substance. Olivia's eyes, usually a calm harbor in the storms of daily life, flickered with unease. She leaned forward slightly, hands folded in her lap, as if bracing herself for a confrontation she had long anticipated but dreaded nonetheless. Daniel noticed every detail, the way her shoulders stiffened, the subtle tremor of her fingers, the quick inhale before she spoke. "I know you've been looking through my past," she began softly, voice almost a whisper. "I suppose I can't hide it anymore." Her gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, Daniel caught a vulnerability that seemed genuine. Ethan. He was part of my life in ways I couldn't articulate. Even to myself. I thought I had moved on. But some feelings, they lingered. Daniel felt a surge of conflicting emotions. There was the expected anger, the raw sting of betrayal. Yet underneath it, a gnawing curiosity. He had uncovered emails, letters, photographs, that all pointed to a hidden devotion she had maintained long before the current fractures in their marriage. Now, faced with her confession, the truth he had pieced together began to take on new, more complicated shapes. "Do you even realize what you're saying?" he asked quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're admitting all of this. After 20 years?" His hands rested on the edge of the table, knuckles white, a physical anchor in the storm of emotion. Olivia swallowed, lips pressed tightly together. "I never wanted to hurt you, Daniel. I truly didn't. There were times I felt trapped, like I was living a life I hadn't chosen entirely. I loved you, yes, but—" Her voice faltered. She shook her head as if to clear a thought too heavy to voice. "I also loved who I had been before, who I could have been with Ethan. I thought I could reconcile those parts of myself. But—" The sentence hung, unfinished, and Daniel felt the duality of her words strike him. There was pain, undeniably, yet beneath it simmered something else, a subtle thrill, a desire that had perhaps never faded. His mind replayed the images he had seen, the laughter shared with Ethan, the touches, the letters. Every evidence now mirrored in her admission, confirming both her sincerity and her deceit. He leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly, searching her face for a hint of manipulation or regret. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city, outside the distant wail of a siren, the occasional horn, the muffled footsteps on the street below. In that silence, Daniel realized how little he truly knew her, how carefully she had curated the narrative he had believed for 2 decades. "What about us?" he asked finally, voice low, almost exhausted. "All the years? Everything we've built?" His gaze fixed on her, demanding honesty, clarity, a confession that could not be tempered by nuance or apology. Olivia looked down, then back up, her expression a mixture of sorrow and defiance. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I never wanted to destroy what we had. I thought I was trying to survive, to honor both the life I have with you and the life I imagined with him. But perhaps I failed at both." Her admission was raw, her tone unguarded. Yet Daniel could sense a subtle calculation behind the words, a careful balance between truth and self-preservation. Daniel exhaled, a long, slow release, feeling the weight of 2 decades pressing on his shoulders. He had expected anger, perhaps confrontation, even recrimination. But what he felt now was a profound disorientation, a mixture of grief, incredulity, and a quiet mourning for the illusions that had kept him tethered to a life that might never have been what it seemed. He recalled their early years, the shared breakfasts in Brooklyn apartments, the hesitant declarations of love, the tender moments that had seemed to define their union. And yet, those memories now felt fragile, like glass that could shatter under the slightest pressure. The intimacy he had relied upon, the trust he had assumed was mutual, was now a landscape riddled with unseen fractures. "You're saying you felt this way for years," he murmured, "and you never told me?" Olivia nodded, eyes glistening. "I didn't know how. I was afraid of losing you, of losing myself, of being judged. And maybe I was selfish." Daniel's thoughts drifted to the practicalities, the unspoken rules of their shared existence. The finances, the home, the social obligations they could no longer navigate as if nothing had changed. But beneath all of that, he confronted the raw, elemental reality. Trust had been broken, not by a single act, but by years of hidden truths and suppressed desires. He looked at Olivia one last time before standing, a mixture of exhaustion and clarity settling over him. "I need time," he said simply. "Time to understand what this means, for both of us." The apartment seemed to exhale with him, releasing the tension, but leaving behind an undeniable chasm. A reminder that the past could not be undone, only confronted. As Olivia retreated to the balcony, Daniel remained seated, absorbing the weight of her words, the complexity of her confession, and the depth of his own disillusionment. The confrontation had revealed truths he had feared, but it had also illuminated the stark reality. The life they had built together was forever altered, and the path forward, whatever it might be, would demand courage, reflection, and a reckoning with every hidden layer of their shared past. The city outside continued its relentless pulse, yet Daniel Harper felt disconnected from every vibration, every glow of neon and hum of traffic. The apartment, once a sanctuary, had transformed into a cage of memories and regrets. Days blurred into nights, punctuated by sleepless hours spent wandering through his own thoughts, replaying Olivia's confession, Ethan's presence in their shared past, and the weight of 20 years slipping away like sand through his fingers. Daniel's interactions became strained. Friends called, voices laced with concern, yet he found their well-meaning inquiries suffocating. Invitations to dinners or gallery openings, once sources of enjoyment, now felt like reminders of his isolation. Each smile, each casual conversation, seemed tinged with judgment. The underlying message was clear. A man abandoned by his wife, forced to confront betrayal and financial uncertainty, was viewed through a lens of societal expectation and whispered critique. Family gatherings became exercises in restraint. His mother, ever perceptive, would glance at him over the table, eyes narrowing, perhaps judging, perhaps grieving silently alongside him. Conversations that once flowed easily now carried an undercurrent of unease. Comments about commitment, success, and stability pressed against the raw nerve of his current reality. Daniel felt the pressure of public and private opinion merging, amplifying the already unbearable weight of his emotional turmoil. In solitude, he allowed himself to confront the tempest within. Anger and grief coexisted, twisting together like storm clouds ready to break. He recalled the early mornings with Olivia, the quiet breakfasts in Brooklyn apartments, the laughter that had seemed to define their union. Now, those memories felt like cruel illusions, bittersweet and mocking, each one a reminder of love lost and trust shattered. At work, Daniel's focus faltered. Meetings that once energized him now felt hollow, tasks mechanical, progress meaningless. Colleagues noted the change subtly, an absent-minded pause, a distracted glance, an unfinished report. But Daniel could only see through a fog of preoccupation. He imagined whispers behind closed doors, judgments framed by the metrics of success, the accumulation of wealth, and the image of a perfect marriage crumbling under the weight of revelation. One night, Daniel found himself on the balcony, staring down at the glittering lights of Manhattan. The city's vibrancy contrasted sharply with his inner desolation. He thought of revenge, a quiet desire to reclaim power in a situation where he felt utterly powerless. But alongside it was exhaustion, a deep-seated weariness that seemed to sap every ounce of vitality. He recognized, with a hollow clarity, that revenge would not heal the fracture. It could only offer a fleeting illusion of control. He turned inward, confronting memories of moments he had taken for granted. Olivia's gentle smiles, the soft brush of her hand on his arm, the shared jokes that had seemed trivial then but now carried the weight of nostalgia and loss. How much of it had been genuine, and how much a performance masking desires Daniel had never recognized? The uncertainty gnawed at him, a persistent ache that no distraction could soothe. Sleep became a battleground. Dreams were filled with fragmented images. Olivia, laughing in sunlight, Ethan's shadowed silhouette, Daniel alone in rooms that had once been shared sanctuaries. He woke each morning with a knot of anxiety and grief pressing against his chest, the city's noise beyond his window, a cruel reminder that life continued indifferently to his suffering. Calls from Olivia were sporadic, clinical in tone, discussing logistics rather than intimacy. Each word she spoke reminded Daniel of the chasm between them, of the emotional distance that had been present long before the formal declaration of betrayal. The practicalities of property division and financial settlements offered no comfort. They were merely markers of a life dissected, stripped of the warmth and security he had once known. In this period of collapse, Daniel discovered a paradoxical clarity. The intensity of his despair sharpened his perception, forcing him to confront not only Olivia's choices, but his own complicity in sustaining illusions. He recognized patterns he had ignored, subtle shifts in attention, unspoken tensions, the quiet undercurrents of desire and secrecy. This awareness, though painful, planted the seeds of eventual reckoning, a cautious understanding that the path forward would require both strategic thought and emotional resilience. Daniel Harper, surrounded by the glittering metropolis yet suspended in a personal winter, realized that the collapse he experienced was not an end but a crucible. Through grief, anger, and disillusionment, he was beginning to see the contours of a future that demanded confrontation, adaptation, and perhaps an unlikely form of redemption. The city outside pulsed on, indifferent. Yet within him, the storm had begun to settle into a new rhythm, one that hinted at both the fragility of life and the endurance required to navigate its most devastating upheavals. The week had begun in a haze of unanswered questions and restless nights when Daniel Harper received an unexpected message. A brief, professional email from Clara Matthews, a former colleague of Olivia. Clara's reputation for discretion and keen observation preceded her, and Daniel felt a flicker of cautious hope. The email suggested a meeting, private, neutral, and crucial. They met at a small cafe tucked away from the main avenues of Manhattan. The city hummed beyond the windows, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation unfolding within. Clara, composed yet alert, regarded Daniel with a mixture of empathy and measured concern. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, revealed an understanding of the hidden dynamics he had been struggling to untangle. "I've known Olivia professionally for years," Clara began, her tone careful but candid. "And I know Ethan too. There are things you're not aware of, things that explain her choices more clearly than the surface would ever show." Daniel listened intently, a knot of tension tightening in his chest. He had already discovered pieces of the puzzle on his own emails, letters, photographs. But Clara promised context, motivations, and patterns that could only come from someone who had observed them up close over time. Clara spoke of Olivia's ambitions, her quiet dissatisfaction with certain aspects of her life, and her long-standing fascination with Ethan. "It wasn't just nostalgia," Clara explained. "She was drawn to the idea of what he represented, of freedom, a kind of life she feared she'd missed. It influenced her decisions long before she told you." Her words were precise, yet each one carried a weight of implication, making Daniel feel both enlightened and unsettled. As they spoke, Daniel realized the breadth of the knowledge Clara possessed. She recounted business meetings where Olivia and Ethan's interactions seemed innocuous, yet Clara had noticed subtle exchanges, glances, pauses, shared jokes that hinted at a private intimacy. She produced printed copies of emails, detailed notes, and observations from years past. Each piece validated the suspicions he had been wrestling with, providing clarity to the blurred outlines of truth and deception. Daniel's gratitude was tempered by the complexity of the situation. Trust was a fragile commodity, and while Clara offered insight, he remained wary of perspectives shaped by personal bias. Yet the depth of her knowledge could not be ignored. It was a lifeline in the emotional storm that had engulfed him. They talked for hours, dissecting scenarios, timelines, and potential motivations. Daniel's mind worked furiously to connect dots, reconstruct events, and understand the interplay between Olivia's desires, Ethan's influence, and the choices that had led to the present crisis. He realized that the betrayal he felt was intertwined with patterns of behavior that had been subtly reinforced over years. Small decisions, overlooked interactions, and moments of indulgence that culminated in profound consequences. Clara also offered practical advice. She suggested ways to approach sensitive conversations, methods to verify information without alerting Olivia, and strategies to anticipate Ethan's likely reactions. Daniel found himself jotting notes, planning steps with meticulous care. The despair that had dominated his recent days began to recede, replaced by a cautious sense of agency. For the first time in weeks, he felt capable of shaping the narrative, rather than being swept along by it. Outside the cafe, Manhattan's lights flickered in the late afternoon haze, a reminder of the relentless pace of life beyond the bubble of their discussion. Daniel glanced at Clara, appreciating the seriousness and discretion she offered. Her alliance was unexpected, but essential. Through her, he could navigate the maze of secrets and deceptions that had clouded his marriage. By the time their meeting concluded, Daniel felt a renewed determination. He knew that knowledge alone was not enough. He needed strategy, patience, and a careful balancing of emotion and reason. Clara had equipped him with the tools to understand Olivia and Ethan, but the execution, confrontation, revelation, and reclaiming control would require his judgment, courage, and meticulous timing. As they parted ways, Daniel stepped onto the bustling streets, a sense of focus settling over him. The weight of betrayal was still present, but now it carried direction. Clara's insight had illuminated pathways that had previously been invisible, transforming his confusion into a plan, his anguish into calculated resolve. For Daniel Harper, the unexpected ally was more than just a source of information. She represented a bridge to clarity, a lens through which he could finally view the tangled threads of the past and the present. And as he walked through the city, the lights reflecting off the wet pavement, he understood that the journey ahead, fraught with emotion, confrontation, and revelation, was one he could now approach with strategy and purpose, guided by the knowledge Clara had provided and the resilience he was determined to cultivate. The city was quieter than usual that evening, as if Manhattan itself sensed the turbulence brewing in Daniel Harper's mind. After days of meticulous investigation, aided by Clara's insights, Daniel had begun to connect threads he had once overlooked. Each email, each subtle interaction, each piece of corroborating evidence painted a picture more disturbing than he had imagined. It became undeniably clear. Ethan had never loved Olivia. The charming smiles, the lingering glances, the carefully timed gestures, all orchestrated for one purpose: financial gain. Daniel felt a wave of disbelief wash over him, mingling with a grudging respect for Ethan's cunning and a deepening anger for his own manipulation. For 20 years, he had assumed the threat to his marriage was emotional, perhaps even moral. Now he realized it was strategic. Olivia sat across from him in the apartment, unaware of the full extent of his discoveries. Her demeanor remained composed, yet Daniel sensed an undercurrent of defensiveness, a subtle anxiety beneath the surface calm. He had watched her closely, observing micro-expressions that now took on new meaning. Every hesitation, every moment of evasion, every vague explanation for her actions suddenly aligned with the reality he had unearthed. "She's in it too," Clara had warned during their last meeting. "Olivia may be a victim, but she's also a participant. She has made choices that she cannot deny, even if she's been manipulated." Daniel had struggled to reconcile this duality: empathy for her entrapment and condemnation for her decisions. The complexity of human desire and error revealed itself sharply, unflinchingly. He spread out the evidence on the dining table: copies of emails between Olivia and Ethan, records of secret bank transfers, photos of meetings that seemed innocent but were laden with coded gestures. Daniel's eyes lingered on a particular email where Ethan meticulously outlined his plan, exploiting both Olivia's emotional attachment and Daniel's assumed complacency. The revelation was almost cinematic in its clarity, and yet terrifying in its implications. Daniel's thoughts drifted back to the past 2 decades. Every shared laugh, every vacation, every quiet night at home now seemed punctuated by shadows he hadn't recognized. He remembered Olivia's distant expressions, the phone calls she had taken with a glance toward him that masked some secret anticipation. Each moment, trivial at the time, was now a signpost of deeper, hidden machinations. The realization struck Daniel not as sudden anger, but as a slow, simmering understanding. The betrayal was layered. Olivia's actions, Ethan's manipulations, the silent complicity of years of misunderstanding. He recognized the seduction of appearances, the curated social media posts, the lavish dinners, the perfect family image, and how easily they had concealed a complex, morally ambiguous reality. Yet, despite the depth of Ethan's scheming, Daniel could not absolve Olivia entirely. She had agency. She had chosen to continue, to engage, to remain silent about her involvement. The line between victim and accomplice blurred, forcing Daniel to confront uncomfortable truths about accountability, love, and deception. Each decision she made had consequences, and Daniel could no longer shield himself behind sympathy alone. He reflected on the practical ramifications. Olivia's willingness to claim half of his assets, the calculated legal maneuvers, and her readiness to sever emotional ties were all part of a complex interplay between desire and strategy. Daniel felt a renewed sense of urgency. Understanding Ethan's motives was only the beginning. He needed to anticipate every step, predict every possible manipulation, and prepare for the moment of confrontation with precision. At night, Daniel sat alone in the dim glow of his office, the city's lights reflecting on the polished surfaces around him. The weight of revelation pressed against him, a dense fog of anger, grief, and calculation. He imagined Ethan's smug satisfaction, Olivia's conflicted expressions, and the tangled web that had ensnared them all. The challenge now was to untangle it, not just for revenge, but for clarity, justice, and ultimately, his own peace of mind. The twist reshaped Daniel's understanding of reality. Olivia was no longer merely the woman he had loved and lost. She was a participant in a scheme far more intricate than he had ever anticipated. Ethan, once a shadow in the background, emerged as the true architect, using charm and financial acumen to manipulate the narrative. And Daniel, for the first time in weeks, felt a spark of agency return. He could see the structure of deceit, the patterns, the hidden motivations, and with this vision came the possibility of reclaiming control. The revelation did not bring closure, nor did it erase the pain, but it provided direction. Daniel Harper, once adrift in despair, now possessed clarity born of observation, deduction, and careful analysis. The storm of betrayal had been reframed. Not merely a collapse of love, but a strategic battlefield where insight, patience, and resilience would determine the outcome. He closed the folder with a measured breath, the weight of understanding settling into a determined focus. Olivia's choices, Ethan's manipulations, the emotional wreckage, all were now elements in a new equation. The path forward would require courage, subtlety, and the meticulous orchestration of truth. Daniel felt the first true sense of purpose he had experienced since the unraveling began. The realization that knowledge itself could be a weapon, and that every next step must be executed with precision and resolve. Daniel Harper had learned one essential truth. Knowledge without action was impotent. With Clara's revelations fresh in his mind, he began to devise a strategy that was neither hasty nor vengeful in a blatant sense, but meticulous, precise, and psychologically nuanced. Manhattan's skyscrapers stretched above him like silent observers, as he mapped each step in his mind, considering timing, perception, and subtle influence. He started by observing Olivia's patterns closely. The small gestures, the routine calls, her work schedule all became data points. Daniel knew that overt confrontation would trigger defensive mechanisms. Instead, he sought leverage through subtle cues, carefully planted observations, and calculated inquiries that would reveal the depth of her feelings for Ethan. Did she act out of true affection? Or was ambition the driving force behind her departure? Clara continued to serve as an invaluable guide. She suggested ways to monitor interactions without breaching privacy, methods to interpret micro-expressions, and the psychological frameworks Ethan often exploited. He relies on predictability, Clara explained. He counts on people reacting emotionally, not logically. You can disrupt that pattern if you stay measured. Daniel noted every word, committing each piece of insight to memory, like a general preparing for a strategic campaign. Each encounter with Olivia became a test, carefully constructed, yet appearing spontaneous. Daniel would introduce topics indirectly, observe responses, and gauge reactions to financial discussions, past memories, and casual mentions of Ethan. He watched for hesitation, for signs of conflict or regret, for tiny flickers of truth in her eyes. Every reaction was catalogued, mentally cross-referenced with information Clara had provided. Slowly, he began to see patterns emerge, glimpses of truth behind the carefully maintained facade. Daniel also fortified his own defenses. He restructured financial matters quietly, ensuring that no impulsive decisions on Olivia's part could compromise his security. Lawyers and advisors were consulted under the guise of routine planning. Daniel maintained appearances while laying invisible barriers. The precision of these moves was critical, for he understood that any misstep could signal desperation or invite retaliation. Yet the strategic maneuvering was not merely tactical, it was deeply psychological. Daniel sought to engage Olivia's conscience and test her motives. He planted subtle reminders of their shared history. A photograph on a table, a reference to a vacation they had cherished, an offhand comment recalling a private joke. Each action was calibrated to evoke memory and emotion, to observe whether affection or calculation dictated her reactions. The tension between what was felt and what was performed became increasingly visible. Amid this slow-burn strategy, Daniel wrestled internally with his own feelings. Rage and grief remained, simmering beneath a composed exterior. He recalled intimate moments, times when trust had been implicit, and he recognized how easily those foundations could be shaken by deception. Yet he also felt a renewed sense of agency, the knowledge that he was no longer merely reacting but shaping the unfolding events. This control brought both relief and ethical disquiet. Every action, every observation, involved a delicate balance between justice and manipulation. Evenings in the apartment became periods of intense reflection. Daniel would stare at the city lights from the balcony, sketching out scenarios, predicting responses, and refining the psychological probes he intended to employ. He imagined Ethan's probable reactions, Olivia's conflicting emotions, and the myriad ways subtle pressure could prompt revelations without direct confrontation. The slow, calculated pace of his strategy mirrored the careful choreography of chess, each move designed to prompt a reaction revealing the next necessary step. Communication with Clara remained discreet and precise. They shared findings, cross-referenced behavioral cues, and adjusted tactics based on new insights. Daniel relied on her objectivity to check his own emotional bias, ensuring that anger or nostalgia did not cloud judgment. Through these exchanges, he constructed a mental map of the psychological terrain, a blueprint for the careful unfolding of events that would ultimately expose motives and force accountability. By the end of the week, Daniel felt a measure of clarity and preparedness. Olivia's responses had begun to reveal the duality of her intentions, desire intertwined with self-interest, affection laced with ambition. Daniel's slow-burn strategy was working. The tension in their interactions was sharpening, like a bowstring drawn taut, ready to release at the precise moment. The city beyond the windows continued its relentless motion, indifferent to the silent machinations within. But Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose and direction. He understood that the climax of this psychological chess game was approaching. Olivia would soon be confronted not with anger alone, but with insight, structure, and consequences that forced her to confront the true nature of her choices. And Daniel, having endured heartbreak, betrayal, and manipulation, was no longer merely a passive observer. He was the architect of the next chapter, measured, deliberate, and fully aware of the stakes. The strategic moves, subtle yet potent, had elevated the tension, setting the stage for confrontation. Every glance, every word, every gesture was a test, a probe. The city lights reflected on polished surfaces as Daniel leaned back in his chair, a quiet determination settling in. The slow burn of strategy had positioned him not just to react, but to command the narrative, revealing truth, testing loyalty, and ultimately reclaiming control over a world that had been disrupted by deception and ambition. The ballroom of the Manhattan Club glimmered with chandeliers, reflecting the muted chaos of private lives hidden behind formal attire. Daniel Harper stood at the edge of the room, observing Olivia and Ethan across the polished floor, each movement meticulously calculated. The city's pulse outside seemed distant, irrelevant. Inside, every glance, every gesture carried weight, a currency of manipulation and revelation. He approached them slowly, measuring his steps against the rhythm of the soft background music. Ethan's confident smile masked his anticipation, unaware that Daniel now understood the game he had so carefully orchestrated. Olivia's posture was composed, yet there was tension in the line of her shoulders, a flicker in her gaze that betrayed uncertainty. Daniel noted it silently, every subtlety a piece of a psychological map he had painstakingly constructed. "Olivia," Daniel began, his voice calm but resonant, cutting through the ambient hum. "We need to talk. Here, now." The simplicity of the statement carried authority. The calm in his tone was disarming, contrasting with the storm of emotion beneath. Ethan's eyes narrowed, sensing a shift in dynamics he hadn't predicted. He exchanged a glance with Olivia, whose expression was momentarily unguarded, a microsecond, revealing both fear and dawning comprehension. Daniel didn't rush. Each pause, each measured word, was designed to provoke reflection, to expose truth. Clara's guidance echoed in his mind. Subtle, indirect pressure often elicited more honesty than confrontation alone. Daniel relied on silence as much as speech, letting the weight of observation press upon them. The tension thickened. Other guests were unaware of the drama unfolding in a private, invisible arena of emotion, strategy, and revelation. "Daniel," Olivia said finally, her voice tight. I didn't expect." She stopped, words failing as the layers of manipulation and deceit pressed upon her. Daniel noticed the quick inhale, the slight shift of weight, the almost imperceptible trembling of her hands. Her composure was cracking, revealing glimpses of genuine remorse and the cognitive dissonance of choices made under manipulation. Daniel's eyes met hers, steady and unwavering. "You've made choices, Olivia. Choices you can't deny. And Ethan? He isn't in love with you. Never was. He only wanted what he could take." Each word landed deliberately, not as accusation, but as revelation. The truth was a weapon, sharper than any raised voice, and Daniel wielded it with precision. Ethan's confident facade faltered, his controlled expression showing cracks for the first time. Daniel sensed the shift immediately. The imbalance of power had swung. The meticulous planning, the psychological probes, the slow burn of observation had converged at this moment. Ethan's arrogance was vulnerable now, exposed under the calm, penetrating clarity of Daniel's presence. Olivia's gaze flickered between the two men, her mind racing. The realization hit her with the force of inevitability. She had been part of a carefully constructed game, her choices influenced but ultimately hers. The desire for security, the allure of ambition, and the nostalgia for Ethan had blinded her. Yet now, faced with the exposed reality, she had to decide. The lingering echo of past affection, the freedom of integrity, or the continued pursuit of ambition. Daniel observed silently, letting the tension build. No further words were necessary. The emotional tableau was enough to force reflection. He noticed Ethan's subtle flinch, Olivia's rapid blinking, the way her shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. The high-stakes interplay of desire, fear, and morality had reached a critical threshold. The room, filled with laughter and muted conversation, contrasted sharply with the private gravity unfolding. Daniel's strategic planning had created a crucible. Every glance, every measured statement, every silent pause contributed to the unmasking of truth. Olivia's internal conflict was visible, a psychological storm restrained behind elegant poise. Finally, Olivia spoke, voice trembling but gaining steadiness with each word. I didn't realize," she confessed, looking at Ethan and then back at Daniel. I thought I knew what I wanted, but I see now. I was blinded." Her admission was both an acknowledgement of manipulation and an assertion of agency, a declaration that she could no longer hide behind excuses or desire. Ethan, momentarily disarmed, tried to recover composure, but the power dynamics had irrevocably shifted. Daniel's calm authority, the evidence he had gathered, and the subtle probes he had employed had exposed the cracks in Ethan's scheme. Olivia's moment of recognition, the twist that reframed her understanding of loyalty, love, and ambition, was the culmination of the strategic slow burn Daniel had orchestrated over weeks. In that moment, Daniel felt a mixture of vindication and restraint. The confrontation had revealed truth without unnecessary spectacle, honor without cruelty. Olivia's choice whether to pursue authentic desire, assert independence, or chase ambition was now entirely hers. forced by clarity and accountability rather than coercion. The lights of Manhattan beyond the ballroom windows glittered like distant stars, indifferent to human drama yet casting a reflective glow on the players within. Daniel realized that this confrontation, meticulously planned and carefully executed, had achieved its purpose: to illuminate deception, reveal motives, and provide space for choices to emerge. The emotional climax was not only about revelation but about empowerment, forcing recognition, responsibility, and the confrontation of moral and emotional truths. As the three stood in tense silence, the air thick with realization and suppressed emotion, Daniel knew the story was reaching its penultimate stage. The confrontation had been precise, cinematic, and psychologically potent, setting the stage for the resolution that would follow, where choices made now would define the lives of all involved. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Daniel's apartment, casting a gentle glow over the room where weeks of tension, revelation, and strategy had finally converged into quiet resolution. Daniel sat in his usual chair by the window, coffee in hand, observing the city waking beneath him. For the first time in weeks, he felt a calm that was neither hollow nor forced an acknowledgement of the emotional battles fought and the truths uncovered. The confrontation with Olivia and Ethan had altered the landscape of his life irrevocably. The slow burn of strategy, the meticulous observation, and the calculated dialogue had achieved their purpose: revelation and accountability. He had learned that control is not simply about outcomes but about clarity and understanding the capacity to face reality, no matter how painful. The city outside reflected this new clarity: stark, honest, and indifferent to the dramas of individual lives, yet quietly beautiful in its constancy. Olivia's absence from the apartment was a reminder of consequences. She had left, but not in triumph. Her eyes had held a storm of recognition during the confrontation. Recognition of manipulation, ambition, and the choices that led her astray. Daniel imagined her walking through the streets of Manhattan, grappling with the truths he had revealed, confronting her own reflection in the glass of office towers, and questioning the values she had compromised. The realization that some losses are irrevocable was a hard truth for both of them, yet necessary. Daniel reflected on the weeks past. The shock of betrayal, the probing of hidden truths, the slow unraveling of facades. Each encounter, each measured observation, had been a lesson in human complexity. People are rarely purely good or evil. They are a mixture of desires, fears, regrets, and ambition. Olivia's actions had been neither entirely malevolent nor innocent. They had been the product of circumstance, longing, and personal choices. Understanding this allowed Daniel to temper his own anger with perspective, to see not just the harm done, but the human fragility underlying it. He remembered the small details: Olivia's trembling hands in the ballroom, Ethan's micro-expressions of panic when confronted, the way Clara's calm counsel had steered him through the labyrinth of deceit. These details, subtle yet profound, had shaped the outcome, teaching him that perception and patience often wield more power than confrontation alone. Daniel realized that the resolution was as much internal as it was external. The clarity he had imposed upon the situation was mirrored by the clarity he now found within himself. In this stillness, Daniel also recognized the necessity of letting go. Revenge had been tempting, a natural reaction to betrayal, yet pursuing it would have chained him to the past. Instead, he embraced reflection and acceptance. Forgiveness, not for Olivia, but for himself, became a quiet cornerstone of his newfound equilibrium. The pain of lost trust remained, a shadow to acknowledge but not to be consumed by. Meanwhile, Olivia's choices, though private, carried weight. Daniel knew she was confronting the consequences of ambition intertwined with desire. She had been forced to examine her motives, reassess her values, and reckon with the human cost of her decisions. Though separated physically from Daniel, her journey was now intertwined with lessons she could not escape: accountability, awareness, and the price of choices made in pursuit of self-interest over authentic connection. The city hummed below, indifferent yet constant, a reminder that life continues, with or without resolution, with or without closure. Daniel sipped his coffee, feeling the slow, grounding rhythm of normalcy return. He understood that the human heart is resilient but delicate, capable of both betrayal and redemption, and that true strength lies in facing one's emotions rather than avoiding them. Evenings brought reflection rather than confrontation. Daniel walked along the Hudson, observing couples, friends, and strangers. In each passing glance, he saw the fleeting nature of connection, the delicate balance of desire, honesty, and ethics. These observations, once anxiety-inducing, now became affirmations. Life is complex. Relationships are fraught with unpredictability. Yet awareness and integrity offer paths to understanding and growth. In the quiet moments, he considered the future. He would not dwell on the past with bitterness. Instead, he resolved to build a life informed by clarity, tempered judgment, and emotional honesty. There remained scars, but also lessons about love, manipulation, ambition, and the intricate dance between personal desire and moral accountability. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the skyline, Daniel felt a sense of completion, though not closure in the absolute sense. Some questions remained unanswered, some choices unresolved. But in facing the entirety of the experience, the betrayal, the confrontation, the revelations, he found liberation. The slow burn of strategy, observation, and reflection had culminated in a moment of insight. A quiet assertion that one can endure betrayal, learn from manipulation, and emerge with integrity intact. Daniel's story ended not with vengeance nor reconciliation, but with understanding. Olivia's path, altered forever, intersected briefly with his in a narrative of human complexity, ambition, and choice. The lessons remained, lingering like the soft glow of city lights at dusk, visible, subtle, and quietly illuminating the profound interplay of love, betrayal, and the values that define us.